Welcome to week 3. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're enjoying this class. I think this is such a fascinating class, such a fascinating topic. Personality, what is it? What are the definitions? What are the hindrances? What does the world believe? How do we define it? What are the theories? What are the approaches? How do we make this more applicable to the individuals coming into our office, whether that's in the church, whether that's in the clinic, some private practice, something of that nature, and or chaplaincy within the hospitals, because you see so many people buying textbooks, listening to podcasts, talking about what personality. And this is a reason why personality assessments have spiked, if you will, since I first started in the field. Why? Because people are wanting to become more and more aware, which is absolutely phenomenal, because I believe that when we become aware, we can create the opportunity for change. Why? Because I believe it's God that creates the awareness within us. Because there's so much about neurology that says that actually 95% of what we do is actually happens from a subconscious orientation. And because of that, then as a result, 5% is actually taking place from a place of actually conscious awareness. And that can seem kind of overwhelming to you, like it did to me right when I first heard it, to the extent that it's kind of led me down this path of how did we come to that conclusion? How did we come to that? What type of research started us in this area of understanding that perspective? And what we have to understand is that so much of our environment shapes who we are when we understand the dynamic of neurology. The last 7 weeks in the womb, the first 7 years, is just all absorbing, all receptivity. And as a result of that, the brain grows from the back to the front. So as a result of that, at the age of 25 for males, 21 for females, what is it that we're becoming consciously aware of? It's those pathways, it's those imprints, it's those programming that took place, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as a result of not only in the here and now after the age of 7, after the age of to 21, 25, thereafter, how do the things create imprinting within us? And so what do I mean by imprinting? Is things of wounded nature, right? And usually the more devastating they are, the more impact that it created and or a deeper imprint. And so it's kind of looking at like this. So you're walking across a field, a muddy field. And if you tiptoed across that, then as a result of that, it wouldn't leave much of an impression. But if that same field, if you stomped across the field, guess what? You're going to leave a deeper imprint, because the very impact that something causes a deeper imprint within our subconscious. Why? Because of repression. And this is the reason why one of the big things that I love helping people in my time with them is, not one, allowing God to bring about awareness and or just the dynamics of what they're communicating, and help them be able to connect some dots so awareness can happen. Why? So that they can walk through this linear progression that I found, that I believe is found in the garden, which is aware, declare, invite, express. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Not really sure how it I guess it does when we talk about healing, and how healing brings about a true persona and or the expression of that personality. Then we can look at it from that standpoint. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this idea of the very things that we repress, the dynamics of who God's called us to be. And you're going to hear me kind of reiterating this time and time again. Why? Because how do we get things in our subconscious, reprogramming those very messages, is from God speaking it, us receiving it, and declaring it, and meditating on it, just as Joshua 1:8 talks about, meditate on my law day and night. Therefore, according to the NIV, you shall be successful. Why? Because the same way that we tell our kiddos that we have received from those that love us, it wasn't just a one-time orientation. Hey, guess what, Brady? I love you. No, it's constant. I love you. I love you. I love you. I love you. Why? Just the same way God is constantly lavishing or singing. I believe it's in, I can't remember where that's found, but he's constantly singing and articulating and showing the vastness of his love over us. Why? So the dynamics of the pathway of what we've been programmed to, for whatever reason, in those first 7 years, can be oriented on God's love, on his message, so that the programming can be shifted and changed. And this is the reason why when we want to take assessments, it's always fascinating when individuals take it, in one season, They walk through some counseling, through some ministry, whatever it may be, and or just the opportunity of how God connects with us. That they take it late, in a later date and time, and their assessment changes. And so this is the reason why I'm always kind of cautious about the very assessments that we take, because we can allow them to actually orient us from a place of identity that actually is controversial to who God says or what God says about us. And so again, it's the idea of like what I've communicated before. It's a transparency. We hold it above into the light and see what reflects. And as a result of that, God can validate the very things that assessment communicates that is true about us, but the very things that are oriented from a place of woundedness, then God can allow that transparency, His light, to reveal those things to us. Why? So that we can bring those things to us, to Him. We can allow the very ashes of what we've experienced to be oriented to His very beauty. And so this week, let me back up. So the book does a phenomenal job of defining personality, the different orientations of methodology, approaches, and theories. And so I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more of the application, just like earlier. And so with that, this week we talk a little bit about kind of what I kind of started to last week, which is the biological approach, right? The whole nature nurture and how much of that plays a role. And that's going to be something that I constantly talk about throughout the orientation of this class. Why? Because it breeds light to who we are. How much of that is genetic? How much of that is our environment? And what place do both of those correlate and assimilate into one? And again, part of this is me asking some questions. Why? To get you to come to the resolution about what it is that you believe. Why? Because the people that are coming in for help, they're going to be sitting across from you. So again, it's great for you to walk through this class, and we're grateful that you're here. It's great for you to orient to the content of this material, but again, it's you that's sitting across from the individual. So what do you believe about nature? What is it that you believe about nurture? What is it that you believe about trait approach, the biological approach, and some of the other approaches that we're going to journey throughout the rest of this class? Again, take this, hold these approaches to the light, and allow God to permeate within you what it is that He wants you to know. As a result of that, how you can apply it. I think one of the things that when we walk through an educational model, I'm grateful for education, love education. Again, I wouldn't be here if I didn't, is the idea that we don't just regurgitate information that we receive, but the idea of the information that we receive, that we hold it over the light and allow God to articulate what's true about that, what may be a little bit of a discrepancy based upon His word. And not only that, but what is it that we need to know? Why? So that we can help people that may come in with a Christian orientation. And again, this is one of the great things about research. This is one of the great things about psychology and science, is that I get the opportunity, as well as you will as well, is get to interact with individuals who are not believers. So what do we do? And again, you get to determine that. Do I see them? Do I refer them? And or do I meet them where they are? It kind of reminds me of Paul when he oriented to Athens. And as a result of that, they had all these displays of foreign gods. But the great thing about that is, one, how Paul interacts with them, and two, one of the shrines to a god of the unknown. And so how did Paul connect with them? Well, part of that was the dynamic of, I believe, the healing that God brought Paul through. Because again, when we first see Paul arrive on site within Scripture, what was his persona? What was his personality? How did he interact? How did he differ based upon the very interaction on his road to Damascus, on his interaction with Ananias? How did that change him based upon the very first time that we see him? Through some of those early orientations of locking up believers, through some of that, the very first, if not the first interaction of him standing when Stephen's getting stoned, right? To see the way that he interacts. I know that we talked a little about Peter, now we're talking about Paul, and we're going to talk about a couple of these disciples. And one of the disciples and apostles is, in the assessment, or the project that I'm asking you to do, is as you take the Enneagram, and again, there is a non-paid one that you don't have to spend a dime on, and one that you can pay and get a little bit more understanding. Again, for this project, I'm not asking you to purchase the assessment. Why? Because we want to make sure that this is as cost effective as possible, and you've already paid for this class. So again, we don't want you to have additional charges and fees within this class. But again, if you want to buy the extended one, then please feel free to do so. But again, in this project, I'm asking you, what was your score, right? The 1 through 9, how did it assess? And then what were the wings that I orient to? How do you see yourself? What was the original intent of this assessment? Was it ever intended to be self-report? Or was it more from a mentor orientation where you got around individuals and they led you through a series of interactions and they were taking in the material, the goodness, the answers, and actually formulating your number as a result of that. So it's really interesting how the assessment has evolved into what we have now, to where it's too long to take and people have created shortcuts to be able to get an answer and or subtype a lot quicker. So it's fascinating, because the way I see history is from the dynamic of how mentors would actually walk through seasons and years of walking through people through different type of scenarios and situations and getting to hear their life. And as a result of that, that's kind of how the scoring was originally brought about. But again, what we have now, are there any flaws to the origination of how it was assessed back in the day versus to what it is now? But kind of going back to my original thought is, what people in Scripture have a subtype similar to yours? And why do you think that? Because again, I think that when we can allow the truth of God and the way that it's unpacked through psychology, through philosophy, through a lot of these orientations that help us understand who am I and what am I doing here, which is, I believe, the ultimate question of humanity and people that are coming through your door. And that's why it's so great to look at a class like personality, because so many people are interested in this very topic. Well, this is just who I am. Well, what is that based upon? Everybody's upset with me, but I'm just this way. I can't evangelize because that's not who I am. What are the very things that we tell ourselves? So again, going back and looking at Paul in the dynamic of the church of Athens, the city of Athens, what did he say? Did he come in there and beat them over the head because of their idol worship? Even though as a result of that, we understand the impact of idol worship? Or did he assimilate himself into the culture and then waited for an opportunity to say, oh, this shrine here, it says to the God of the unknown. Hey, do you want to know its name? Do you want to know about him? And as a result of that, does Paul and who he is, does he change over time? Does he change based upon this interaction that he has with God as he's riding to Damascus and Jesus visits him and impacts him significantly to the time where Ananias, based upon what God spoke in him, to go lay hands on him and allow God to heal and allow his eyes to be open? Well, if his eyes were open, what were they open to? And as a result of that, what we understand through research through Dr. Caroline Leafs is the idea of what's in us, what permeates in our soul because of healing, because of truth, but also from the standpoint of woundedness, that there is a lens over our soul, and what we allow to assimilate in is the way that we project out. Towards who? Anything and everything. Towards God, towards our spouse, towards our parents, towards our children, towards anybody. So when we look at the journey that Paul is on from the time of Stephen to the time of his interaction with Jesus on the road to Damascus, from the time of Ananias to the time of him coming and all throughout the New Testament, to him, and of course I continue to articulate this time of him at Athens. Why? Because he's around philosophers. He's around so much of the Greek Orthodox and around some individuals who were very intellectual, conceptual. And as a result of that, he met them where they were to do what? To be able to articulate the very message that God put in him. Why? How? And so as we talk about Paul, what kind of type do you think? Do you think he was a 1? Do you think he was a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8, or a 9? And so what about this assessment has caught on with fire in the church and even outside the church? I was introduced to the Enneagram about 7 or 8 years ago. And the name, I'm showing you kind of a little bit about my religious upbringing. And again, grateful for it to some degree. But again, how it kind of held me back is I remember taking a supervision class for to become an LPC supervisor, so I can supervise individuals walking and trying to get their LPC designation with the state board. And I remember sitting through this class and they were telling us, hey, guess what? For some homework, because all your hours aren't going to actually be designated in this class, so you're going to have some homework. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to read this book called oh goodness, Brady, what was the name of that book? Maybe it'll come to me. It was a phenomenal book, but it played with me just from the standpoint of, oh goodness, that's going to bug me. I apologize. Hopefully I can come back. And The Alchemist, okay? I don't know if you read it or not. Again, I'm not endorsing it, but it was one of my favorite books. But again, okay, so in that, as well as taking this test called the Enneagram. And the first thought I had was, Enneagram, And they showed some pictures of it and kind of just put the ball on the tee for us as we were dismissing for our first day. So we had to take 2 different days. I think it's changed since I've taken it. And they were both full days, and so they're both on Fridays, and one was like in September and one was like in October. So we were there for all day on a Friday, and towards the last 30 minutes, the instructor was talking about why and the if and how and all the different expressions of this assessment. And this is the first time I've been introduced to it. I took a class in graduate school called personality psychological testing, where we took a lot of testing, we took a lot of assessments, we took a lot of assessments. And that's where I got introduced to a lot of these, but I had not heard of the Enneagram. And so I'm sitting there thinking, you're telling me I have to take this assessment? Well, in order to get this certification, I kind of need to. So I did. And I remember being elated with the discovery. Wow, I'm reading through the results and it was like, wow, it almost seems like this thing has my number. Well, a couple things. One, I really didn't take into consideration that it was self-report, right? It was showing me the very things that I was inputting into this very assessment. Now, Brady, you may say, now, Brady, you're kind of coming across from this as kind of a pessimist, right? Well, let me give you some context. And again, I'm allowing you to land where you want to be, because I think the world of this assessment, as long as we're holding it to the light and allowing God to validate what needs to be validated. And as a result of that, showing us the very areas that we need to become aware of so that we can transact the very things that we've repressed so that we can allow this beauty for ashes that he talks about within Scripture. So kind of giving you a little historical background of my introduction to the Enneagram. So I started looking, how do I become certified in this? And again, there are some certifications in this. And again, a lot of people are doing really, really well becoming certified as life coaches, as counselors, and really specializing in this assessment. But a lot of the assessments that get training are kind of up north. I don't know why. Maybe they've kind of oriented here further south. But when I first started looking into them, and they were really, really expensive. And it makes sense because people have bills to pay and things of that nature. So again, when you go through certifications, typically they're a little bit more expensive. Okay. But then as it became more of a household name, I would hear how people were utilizing it. And I was getting a little frustrated. Why? Because it almost seemed like we were celebrating bondage. I took this, and as a result, I'm this number, and because of that, this is who I am. And you'd hear it, and you're like, well, wait a second. How does that validate with Scripture? I don't know. And again, these were questions I was asking in my mind because I always wanted to be sensitive about how I interacted with. And these aren't people that were coming into the office to see me personally, for professionally. These are people that I were interacting with on a personal level. And then it got to the point where people would ask, oh, so what's your name? Okay, what's your number? And then you tell them your number, and they'd be like, no, you can't be a this, you have to be that. And you're like, whoa. So do I even tell people my name or anything about me? Because if I just tell them my number, then as a result of that, they know everything about me, right? And of course, that's a little bit of the cynical nature, or not the cynical nature, but how cynical I can be at times. But again, is there benefit in this assessment? Yes. For the original purposes, yes. For holding it over to the light, yes. To be able to create context, to be able to show people where they are? Yes. To allow people to assimilate into areas that God never called them into. And that's my concern for this assessment. Do I think it's brilliant? Absolutely. Do I think it's a benefit? Most definitely. Do I think it has a place in the kingdom? Absolutely. But the dynamics of how we're utilizing it has me a little concerned. Why am I communicating this to you? Not so that you will take and say, okay, this is what we need to know and how we need to unpack that because that's the way he thinks. No. It's again understanding both sides of the table and saying, what do I think? What do I know? How do I want to utilize this in the professional setting that God's calling me to? Brady, do you ever utilize it? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But my concern is the idea of, well, guess what? I'm this number, and all the things that it says about this number is exactly who I am. And because of that, we celebrate everything about that instead of holding it to the light, and that's my concern. When we use these assessments, and that was the great thing about what I saw in your Blackboard discussions based upon week 2 with Myers-Briggs. Again, does it have a lot of validity and reliability? Absolutely, but we got to understand why. It's because we are putting we are inputting things from who we are into this assessment. It's calculating and putting something out in our hands, the very thing that we told it to communicate. So where's that coming from? A subconscious orientation, again, that 95%, right? To hopefully bring us to that 5%. Why? So that we can connect with God. Our conscious, creative, alpha orientation is always to remain in a place of love. Where is that? In a conscious formation. Even though this is a million times stronger than this. Why? Because we have been so oriented from a subconscious standpoint. That's part of the reason why it's a million times stronger. But if we can stay in a conscious state of God's love, what happens? This is the very place that we orient from. By how? By continuing to allow these assessments, these validations, these words of God, or the assessments that we're taking to hold over the light so God can show us the validations to get us to a place of saying, oh, that's who I am. Oh, that's who I am. You see, because you go back and look at Paul, guess what? He was a deliverer of a message. He was a deliverer of a message. Even standing at Stephen, when they're stoning him, he was still delivering a message. But was it the right message? And if not, then why was it? What did he see himself as a result? And how did he come to that orientation of seeing himself from that very place of believing that's who he is? And if that's who he is, this is the way to unpack that from a place of personality. What changed? What remained the same as a result? Just as we talked about Peter in week 1, this idea of him having a interaction after practice where Jesus asked him 3 questions, which can be considered very insensitive, but Jesus, knowing the orientation of his soul, was very sensitive to who Peter was. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Why? Because he went back to old ways, and Jesus had to remind him who he was. Peter had a message. Paul had a message. You have a message. And guess what? It's not if we're or communicating that and articulating that message, but what is the motivational factor that articulates that very message about who we are in reflection to who he is in us, to be able to be transparent and reflected in all the images that everywhere we walk, everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we think, everything that we feel, to everything that we desire. Now again, Brady, you have to understand the dynamic of the enemy. I get that. But from the place of Paul, what do we see? Because Paul experienced a lot of heartache. In his ministry, he experiences a lot to the point where I'm not too sure I would have continued. The whole idea of the viper jumping out of the fire, I grew up out in the country, and so we learned to mow with our looking down, so you didn't really have straight lines. Why? So that you didn't get anywhere near a snake, because we had rattlesnakes, much less a viper. That thing attached in my hand, I'd be like, I think I'd be saved. I'm done. But Brady, again, going further on, we understand Paul shook it off. Why? Paul knew who he was. How? And if you know who you are, how do we unpack that from a place? So when we take this assessment, as we look at this very project, and again, I remember overseeing a lot of practicum and graduate level interns at a church that I was a part of, and part of my role was helping them walk through this process of who am I? Because the more I understand who I am, the more I'm going to be able to help individuals by unpacking that. And I'd have them take the Enneagram. And I remember people sitting at my desk as I'd sit on my couch, and they would be almost in grief. And they would be whoa, oh wow. And I'd ask them, hey, what's going on? And they would just couldn't believe what it is that they're reading. And so I'd always ask them, okay, say, hey, here's what I want you to do between now and the next time that we meet. For the ones that were married, I said, hey, go take this and read this to your spouse. And let them tell you, hey, what about this speaks truth, speaks to the way that you are, right? Get around your friends, get around your parents. Now, again, part of that is subjectivity. Why? Because of the people closest to us are for us in such a way that they may want to always pat us on the back. And again, that's great. We need that. We need that encouragement. But where's that objectivity? By hearing that from those individuals, but also getting to hear from that love, their objectivity in that, but holding it over the light by allowing God to show us who we truly are. Again, going back to Paul. Paul had a message. Paul was a messenger. His message was to anybody that worshipped Jesus, he was going to walk out. That was his message. And I think he was probably revered because of it. But in a moment in time where Jesus introduced who he was to him, everything changed. From the physical going to the opportunity of the emotional anguish that he felt as he waited, not knowing what was going to happen, to the pleas that he cried out from the very depths of his soul. To God speaking to a man and saying, hey, here's an individual. I want you to go lay hands on him. Again, we haven't even talked about Ananias. Can you imagine knowing the very name? Okay, God, who do you got? Oh, Paul? Ooh. I think I'm gonna take a rain check on that, God. I don't think I'm supposed to be the one that's supposed to do that. If you heal him, God, and he opens up his eyes, and knowing the act that I just did by laying my hands on him and healing him, and allowing you to God to heal him, how do I know I'm not going to be the one that he turns around and be his next victim? Interesting, but who was Ananias? And what did he believe about God and about himself? And really to unpack that, to walk into a place of not knowing what kind of fate awaited him, to do what it was that was asked of him. Why? By being who God called him to be. And because of that, he impacted a man that we read about still to this day. We only hear about Ananias, once? My theologians out there, was there more than once that we hear about this man? But the dramatic impact that he had. Think about the individuals that are going to come into your office that you're going to have the opportunity to impact. Why? Because they know that they have a purpose. But they're expressing it in a way that was never oriented based upon how they were died and redeemed for. And so could you take an assessment such as the Enneagram, put it in front of them, help them come to the very conclusions, whether a believer and or not, by helping them walk across that and asking them questions, such as Jesus did. Oh, this is me. Okay, how do you know that to be true? What's that based on? Have you always been like that? Those people that knew you when you were 3 years old, would they say this about you? And asking some questions to the point of what? Awareness. Again, if we go back through this process, and this is one of the processes, again, if this is helpful, great, that I always want to walk people through, if they're willing, is the same process that we see the Father walk Jesus through in the garden. Awareness. Jesus was aware of what his body was doing, what his body was telling him. It was about awareness. And through that awareness, because the blood trickling down on the face and just all the anguish and pain and everything else that he experienced, to the point that he declared. And why is declaration important is because our mind, when the body tells the mind that I'm in pain, the mind tries to create a defense mechanism to try to get us to run, right? To run. It tries to project us into the future and start thinking about futuristic things, and or it fixates us on the past, right? And we can see this from the standpoint of the inner child phenomenon, right? And so in that, what we see people do when they feel pain, they run. And when we don't stay and sit in the pain, now we have to be very sensitive and understanding how do we articulate this, why? Because it can be very triggering. And we need to talk about how do we help people that are triggered. So aware, declare, so that they can sit in that moment. And that's one of the very things that I tell people all the time, that now this doesn't have to do with personality, even though it has to do with personality. Why? Because it helps people walk through a place of healing in hopes what? That they can receive truly who they are, so that they can express that, thus personality. So aware, declare, and declaredness allows us to be present in that moment. It allows our mind not to create this self-defense mechanism so that we can stay in that present moment. Then invite, just as we see. Jesus was aware of what was going on. He declared in a very sophisticated, very articulate way, basically, in the nutshell way I'd take it is, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And what do we see now? The Father being a part of this, the invitation part. If we're aware of where we are and we declare where we are, right now I'm in pain. Right there. I'm aware of my pain. I declare that I'm in pain. Not that I'll always be in pain, or I'm declaring something over myself. I'm aware and I'm declaring where I am in this moment. Then we invite God into this. But God, I invite you into my pain. And as a result of that, what's taking place? All of God's love, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, all of that is being assimilated into that very moment. Why? Because we're not strong enough to actually carry it ourselves. And then as a result of that, the very thing that we see Jesus do is we see him get up and walk it out. Thus, the last thing is expression. Get it out. Whatever the attempted to try to come over a person in them in the same container of their identity that impacts how they express that, thus personality, they express it. And you're going to hear me talk about that a lot, right? Aware, declare, invite, express. Aware, declare, invite, express. Aware, declare, invite, express. And so in that, when we help individuals come to this realization and revelation, the idea of hopefully allowing them to have a very similar interaction that Peter did, that we talked about in week 1, where Jesus has this little side conversation at breakfast. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Or the very same kind of interaction that Paul had on the road to Damascus. Something that is personal and sensitive to them that only an all-knowing, all-caring, all-loving God such as Jesus would have with the individual sitting in with them. Why? Because if their experiences and their pain and their fear has been telling them who they are, then how are they expressing that? Thus personality, right? The expression of who we are, the expression of what's in me. So as we look at the Enneagram, of course, I put the link in y'all's material this week for the Enneagram Institute, a YouTube to kind of create a foundation. Continue to think through what I talked a little bit more, what I talked about a little bit in week 2 about the genetic, as we talk about the biological approach this week, right? What do you believe? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll come, whether this week, probably next week, because even though it's discussed within this book, and as you can tell, I probably won't follow the book as much as the way it's defined within his table of contents, because so much about this is, if that makes sense. And so we're going to move all around, but I want you to continue following the book, even though I may not follow it within the video lectures. So what do you believe about genetics? How do you come to that conclusion? What do you believe about the very environments? How do you come to that conclusion? And where do these two realms, if I can call it that, meet? Do they intersect? Do they both wage war against one another? Or is there an assimilation? And or does one take precedence over the other? Is one more significant in the Old Testament versus the New Testament? Maybe, maybe not. But again, what is it that we're after? We're after the conclusion of who am I and what am I doing here? Who am I and what am I doing here? I had the opportunity of getting to work with some individuals who are very aggressive in their approach against God. And this orientation of helping people come to the understanding of who am I, what am I doing here? Oh, well, Brady, I read your bio, you're a believer, so I'm not interested in God. Okay, I understand that. So are we going from a philosophical standpoint? Are we going from a psychological standpoint? Are we going from a sociological standpoint? What standpoint do you want? Because again, we're still going after this answer. Who am I and what am I doing here? And the opportunity of what God allows us to do when we meet people where they are, just as Paul did in Athens, it creates the opportunity of what? The very message God's placed in you. By doing what? By being there in the present and getting to express who God's called you to be, who He's died and redeemed you to be for that very message, just as He did with Paul. In hopes of what? That people may believe. That people may believe. So as a result of that, I look forward to getting to read your projects. There's no Blackboard discussion week 3 because I want all your time to be utilized in working on this project. I hope you have fun with it. I can't wait to hear your thoughts, the good, and everything in between. Have a great week 3. Bye.